Hi there, I'm Craig and I'm here at Colonial Michilimackinac in Mackinac City. Now, if you visited the fort in the past, you know that we're reconstructing it to what it may have looked like in the mid to late 1770s. That's the time period that we're interpreting here today. That's also the time period of the American Revolution. And believe it or not, the American Revolution, although most of the fighting took place hundreds and thousands of miles away from here, it did have some really big lasting impacts upon the community here at Michilimackinac. And over the past few years, we've actually been going year by year through each individual year of the American Revolution and taking a look at what was happening out east, in Canada, around the world, and here at Michilimackinac. This year, we're going to look specifically at the year 1777, which is a pretty important year in the military history of the war, but there's also a lot going on here at Michilimackinac as well. And something that's really important to remember about the year 1777 is that all those revolutionary events that are happening out on the East Coast and elsewhere, they have a direct impact upon the people here, especially the local indigenous people, the Anishinaabe. Those are the people who are probably most directly participating in those events. And so over the next little while, we're actually going to walk around the fort and talk a little bit more about what went on here in 1777, how the people here reacted to those events, and how they participated in them as well. So before we dive too deeply into what's actually going on here in 1777, it's important to just remember what Michilimackinac was at that time. And although we call it a fort today, and yes, there were British soldiers stationed there at that time, there were about 70 men from the British 8th Regiment of Foot stationed at Michilimackinac in the 1770s, it is much more a civilian community that just happens to have some soldiers stationed here. Again, there's those 70 soldiers of the 8th Regiment. At the height of summertime, there might be a few thousand people at this community. All of them, whether they were British, French Canadian, Native American, all of those people are here because of the fur trade. Michilimackinac is a great transshipment point for the Great Lakes fur trade. So there would be all sorts of trade goods being shipped out west from cities like Montreal and Quebec and Albany. These are manufactured goods like axes and knives and kettles, blankets, firearms, things that the Native Americans of this area want but maybe can't make for themselves. So those trade goods get shipped out here to Michilimackinac. At the same time, there are furs being shipped out of Native American communities out to the west or up north that the Native people have been trapping and selling to European traders. Those furs get shipped to Michilimackinac as well, and they're essentially transshipped here. It's not a business transaction, it's just unloading one canoe and putting those trade goods or those furs into another. Michilimackinac is ideally situated for that because we're right here on the Straits of Mackinac. The water is the highway in the 18th century, and from this spot, if you're motivated enough, you can go really all over the eastern part of North America. So again, Michilimackinac is ideally situated to take part in that massive fur trading enterprise. And again, that's why most people are here. Now, as we get into 1777, you kind of have to step back a couple years to understand the events that are going to be happening. You actually have to go back to 1775, the start of the American Revolution, because in 1775, one of the first things the Americans decided to do was actually invade Canada. They thought that the Canadians would welcome them with open arms, that they would become a 14th colony joining the rebellion, and the Americans were pretty successful. They're able to capture Montreal, they lay siege to Quebec, and they actually occupy the major cities of Canada for most of the winter of 1775-1776. Of course, this is a problem for the British, and the governor of British Canada, a man named Guy Carleton, actually led the resistance from Quebec. He was there besieged in the city for most of the winter, and in early summer of 1776 he got some reinforcements and he actually started a counterattack, pushing the Americans back, trying to drive them out of Canada. And the British garrison here at Michilimackinac, led by a man named de Pister, actually attempted to contribute to that counterattack. Now, de Pister knew that he couldn't send the soldiers out from Michilimackinac. They needed to stay here. And so instead, he turned to the Native Americans of the Upper Great Lakes. These indigenous people were trade partners, but they're also diplomatic partners, and they're going to become military partners. So in the summer of 1776, de Pister organized a very large war party of tribes from all over the Upper Great Lakes and dispatched them to Montreal to assist the British with driving out the Americans. Now, de Pister Pister didn't just send all of those indigenous people off on their own. He actually sent a few European liaisons with them, kind of chief among them being a man named Charles Langlade, who is born here at Michilimackinac in 1729. He actually had a house over here in this southeast corner of the fort until the early 1760s. And Langlade's pretty interesting because his father was French and his mother was Odawa. So he had both European and indigenous relatives. It allowed him to really easily move back and forth between both of those worlds and act as a liaison. De Pister really trusted him, a lot of the native people really trusted him, and he's going to become a key player throughout the rest of the war here at Michilimackinac, even though he didn't really actually live here anymore at that time. He lived over in Wisconsin. Now, Langlade's war party gets to Montreal midsummer 1776, only to find that the British have already been successful. They've driven the Americans out. And so they basically are told, thank you, but you can go home now. So they return here to Michilimackinac without firing a shot. But that's going to set a pattern that we'll see again and again and again throughout the war. These war parties going out from Michilimackinac to assist other British forces elsewhere in North America. Now, Guy Carleton, after successfully driving the Americans away from Quebec and out of the city of Montreal, actually pursues them south into New York, down Lake Champlain, but it's kind of a slow campaign. He's very careful, he's very considerate of his supply lines, and a lot of people actually start to criticize Carleton for his perceived slowness and his lack of activity. They are able to actually, again, follow the Americans all the way down to the south end of Lake Champlain near a place called Ticonderoga. There's a naval battle fought on Lake Champlain in October 1776, which the British, in some senses, win. But with that, Carleton decides to withdraw back up to Canada and wait until 1777 to try and fully crush the rebellion in the New York area. Again, people criticized him for that. In particular, John Burgoyne, one of his officers, actually thought that he had not been nearly active enough, and so went back to England in the winter of 1776 with all sorts of ideas about how he could be more aggressive, how he would be a better leader, and how he could actually envision the end of the war, at least in this northern theater. So let's actually go take a closer look at what the British war plans and their war aims were for 1777. So as 1777 dawned, the British were really trying to think about what their strategy would be for the year. They had enjoyed a whole string of successes in 1776, not only Carleton's successful repulsion of that American invasion, driving them back down into New York, but General William Howe, who commanded most of the British forces in the American colonies, also was able to drive the Americans out of New York City, really out of southern New York, across into New Jersey, and really even into Pennsylvania at the very end of the year. And so the British were looking for ways to follow up on that. Now, Howe personally decided that he was going to target Philadelphia. He was going to target the rebel capital and potentially capture the rebel leadership. Maybe that would provide a quick end to the war. Meanwhile, up north, Carleton put forth his own plans for coming back down south into New York, targeting Albany. But John Burgoyne, who had served with Carleton in 1776, he had actually gone back to Britain with his own much more aggressive plans that he was pushing to leaders in the government and to the king himself. And Burgoyne's plan, which was the one that ultimately was chosen, called for an army to again move south out of Canada, following the Lake Champlain corridor, going south towards the Hudson River, perhaps towards New York City, but also with options to operate in western New York in the Mohawk Valley, but also to push east into Connecticut. There was some thought that perhaps if the British could encircle New England, they could more or less chop the head off of this revolution. If they could isolate the rebellious colonies there in the Northeast, the whole thing would just kind of wither on the vine. Now, something else that's very important that the British decided to do in 1777 was go all in on the employment of Native American war parties. They had done this in small doses before. I mean, there is that war party that, for instance, comes from Michilimackinac in 1776. But by and large, the British had not wholeheartedly embraced using Native Americans as auxiliary troops and as allies on the battlefield for a whole variety of different reasons. But in 1777, the government decided that they would actively recruit as many Native American warriors as possible to operate alongside British forces. Burgoyne, in his plans, called for at least 1,000 Native American men to join his forces operating out of Canada. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Those Native warriors were intended to be used as skirmishers and as scouts, kind of relying upon their natural skills. But they were also to be used as a terror weapon. The British knew that a lot of Americans were terrified of Native war parties because over the past, several decades, there had been all of these small clashes between people out on the fringes of society, basically encroaching upon Native land, Native people fighting back. And so the Native Americans had this real reputation as very fierce fighters and as something to be afraid of. And the British decided that they were going to capitalize on that in 1777. Now, it's important to remember that the Native people who decided to cast their lot with the British were not doing so because they considered themselves British subjects. They didn't particularly care about the British war aims, other than the fact that the British shared a common goal with them of keeping those American colonists kind of out there towards the Atlantic coast and not allowing them to come out here into the West. The British didn't want them to do that for a variety of reasons, primarily economic. They wanted to maintain, for instance, the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley as a source of raw materials. Again, the raw material here at Michilimackinac would have been furs, and the Native people didn't want those American settlers coming out there because they knew that they would try and dispossess them of their land. They wanted to stay in their homelands where they had been for generations. And so again, the Native people decide to cast their lot with the British by and large because they have a similar goal: to limit American expansion. It's again not because the Native people were overly loyal to King George or anything like that. They just shared a common goal. And it's very important to remember that all of these various Native nations, they all exist more or less separate of one another. They all have their own needs and their own motivations, and that extends all the way down to the individual Native people. There really was not a Native American general who could just order all of the men in his band or in his community to go off and fight. It really was an individual decision. And as a result, it relied a lot upon the individual personality, the individual charisma, the individual speaking skills of particular leaders within each community to try and convince other people to join up with them. And so, again, this Native component to the campaign in 1777 is going to add a high degree of individuality. It's going to add a whole different set of motivations to the British war aims, and it's not always going to mesh very well with what the British want. The British had one way that they thought they were going to fight the war, and one way they thought they were going to employ these Native warriors. These Native American people, as individuals, had a whole other set of ideas that sometimes lined up with what the British wanted, but a lot of other times didn't. And we'll actually see that as we move through the summer of 1777. Now, here at Michilimackinac, people didn't really know that any of this is going on in early winter 1777. Charles Langlade, who had again accompanied that war party out to Montreal in the summer of 1776, he finally got back here in February 1777. But he had been traveling for quite a while, so even he was unaware of these brand new war plans in this desire to recruit Native people. But there was some thought that more war parties would be needed. So as soon as Langlade returned here to Michilimackinac in February, de Pister tasked him with going to Wisconsin and essentially starting to raise more war parties for use in summer 1777. De Pister himself turned to the local Native people and started trying to feel them out, trying to get them on the side of the British, trying to encourage them to join up with a potential war party. The people who lived here at Michilimackinac, by the way, are the Anishinaabe. Today we might refer to them as Odawa or Ojibwa or Potawatomi. They probably refer to themselves as Anishinaabe. And again, there's a very large Anishinaabe community right here in northern Michigan around Michilimackinac, and de Pister would have been turning to that community to start recruiting for war parties. Now, again, because the world is essentially frozen out from Michilimackinac at this point, the lakes are frozen, so no one can really come and go. It was pretty surprising that Langlade actually made it back here in February. There's not a whole lot that's going to happen until the lakes thaw. That actually happens in April, and let's actually take a look at how this campaign for 1777 began. Now, although in the summertime Michilimackinac is a very busy place, it's very well connected to the outside world thanks to those water routes, in the wintertime it can be very, very isolated. It's very difficult to move when all the lakes are frozen, and so the community here was essentially frozen out from the rest of the world for the winter of 1776-77. Now, although Langlade had returned here in February, he had been traveling for several months, so even his information really wasn't up to date. And Michilimackinac didn't really reconnect with the outside world until April 11th. That's when a trader named Lamothe arrived here, and he brought news with him of some of the late season victories that the British had enjoyed in 1776 and some further inkling of the war plans for 1777. De Pister immediately dispatched more supplies to Langlade to assist his recruiting efforts over in Green Bay. He actually sent soldiers, at least a few soldiers, over to Wisconsin to assist those recruiting efforts. And De Pister also turned to some of the other traders here at Michilimackinac and asked them to use their connections within native communities really around the Great Lakes to continue that recruiting effort. For instance, he sent people down to St. Joseph in southwest Michigan to really start recruiting there as well. Now, meanwhile, back in Britain, plans had been finalized for the coming campaign. Burgoyne was placed in overall command at the end of February. The king signed off on his war plan in early March. Burgoyne then recrossed the Atlantic and arrived in Quebec in early May. And just about a week later, by mid-May, he actually began the campaign. He started the army moving. And Burgoyne's army that he had assembled there in Quebec was quite large. There were about 4,000 British troops, about 3,000 German auxiliary troops. There were some Canadian militiamen that Carleton had activated to join the campaign, and there were already Native Americans serving alongside British troops with Burgoyne. They were primarily from the St. Lawrence River Valley, and most of them were somehow associated to or related to the Six Nations of the Iroquois. And so Burgoyne set off on this campaign, again, to push down south through the Hudson Valley towards New York City. There was also going to be a diversionary attack out of western New York under the command of a man named Barry St. Ledger. He too was going to rely upon native people recruited locally. Some actually came from as far away as Detroit, as well as other soldiers of the 8th Regiment who would have been stationed at Fort Niagara. But again, that was always just supposed to be a diversion. The main thrust was going to be Burgoyne's main army moving south down along Lake Champlain, down the Hudson River, towards New York City. Now, again, here at Michilimackinac, De Pister's recruiting efforts continued throughout this entire time. He did report that he started to see some hesitation, especially amongst the local Anishinaabe. Back in February, when Langlade had returned, De Pister was actually worried that they were simply too enthusiastic. He worried that he wouldn't be able to stop any of them from going out there. He thought that everyone would just get up and go join that war effort. But by April, there was some hesitation starting to creep in. De Pister blamed that not only on agitation from rebel agents down in the Ohio Valley, but also Spanish agents. Remember that Spain controlled most everything west of the Mississippi at this point in time, and although Spain had not yet formally joined the war against Britain, they did still have an interest in destabilizing and eroding British control out here. So De Pister really had his work cut out for him, trying to recruit people from really all over the Western Great Lakes, people with a whole variety of different motivations. And fortunately, he was rather good at it. So let's kind of pause for a minute and just take a closer look at what De Pister was doing here. Now, as I mentioned before, Arent De Pister is the military commander of Michilimackinac. That means he's responsible for the 70 or so soldiers of the 8th Regiment who would have made up the garrison here, so soldiers dressed just like I am right now. That obviously would have taken up a great deal of his time, but he has several other responsibilities on top of that. There really was not civil leadership here at Michilimackinac in the 1770s, so a lot of those functions also fell to De Pister. Not only was he responsible for the soldiers, he was also responsible for the much larger civilian community here, and also responsible for making sure that all of those various people essentially got along with one another and that everything ran smoothly. Michilimackinac, again, is key to the Great Lakes fur trade, so it was on De Pister to make sure that the French and the British merchants here at Michilimackinac, the voyageurs hauling all this stuff, the Native American trappers and traders who were supplying the furs. It was on to Pister to make sure that all of those people at least got along well enough to make sure the regional economy kept functioning. Now, on top of all that, de Pister also acted more or less as the British ambassador out here to Native America. Because although Michilimackinac is very much a European settlement, and this is technically part of British Canada in the 1770s, those are kind of loose concepts the further and further away you get from where we're standing right now. Again, this is Native American territory. We're in the homelands of the Anishinaabe right now, just as they would have been back in the 1770s. And so it was de Pister's job to act as a representative of the British government to all of these various independent sovereign nations scattered all over the western Great Lakes. And fortunately, de Pister was very good at that. He was able to juggle all these various responsibilities, and he was a very capable diplomat. He understood the various motivations of all these various native groups, understood what they wanted from the British, what they wanted from the fur trade, what they needed from the British military here, and was able to actually make sure that everyone got along well enough, again, to at least make sure that the fur trade continued to function. Now, in the summer of 1777, those skills really did come to the forefront, because by early June, all of those various war parties that had been recruited in places like Wisconsin or down in southwest Michigan, they started assembling here at Michilimackinac. Langlade brought a lot of people back from Wisconsin with him. People came up from the south. And so in the space of about 2 weeks in June 1777, there were about 400 Native American warriors who assembled here, and they came from a whole variety of different nations. About 150 of them were Anishinaabe, so they are the people who were living here at that time. De Pister placed them under the command of a man named Magikiwis, who is an Ojibwa war leader who lived right here locally at the Straits of Mackinac. Langlade brought Winnebagos, he brought Sac and Fox, there were Potawatomis that came up from the south. And again, de Pister had to juggle all of these groups as they came in, because although they had all more or less agreed to fight alongside the British, they didn't necessarily get along with one another. So for instance, in the space of one day, there was a Sac and Fox war party that came in, and there was also a Potawatomi war party that came in. De Pister knew that he had to send one of those groups away before the other arrived, because the Sac and Fox and the Potawatomi were traditional enemies, and he knew that if they were in the same place together, there was going to be trouble. So he very deftly sent some of them off first and kind of delayed the second group just to keep the peace between all of these various nations who are kind of gathering here to fight alongside the British. There are Dakota people, so Sioux people who come out of the far west. They're under the command of a leader named Wapasha, who de Pister had dealt with before. They all come here, they get outfitted by the British. De Pister would have probably provided them with food, perhaps some ammunition, some other supplies. They probably would have had access to a government blacksmith to repair their weapons and other things. And then they would have all been sent out east under the nominal command of various European liaisons. So for instance, Langlade accompanied the main body out east, and there were other French traders with strong connections with the native community who accompanied these war parties as they traveled out to join Burgoyne. Although de Pister was very busy supervising the arrival and departure of all of those various Native American war parties, making sure that they were equipped properly, and also spending a great deal of money to make sure that they had everything they needed, de Pister actually spent over 20,000 pounds in the summer of 1777 to outfit those war parties. That's by no means the only thing taking place here at that time. Remember that most of the people who lived in this community were civilians, and they were associated with the fur trade in some way. So for instance, the people who would have lived in this row house here behind me, they were civilians, most likely civilian merchants, and they enjoyed a very, very successful trading season in the summer of 1777. Now, after the British had driven the Americans out of Canada back in 1776, Guy Carleton, the governor, actually instituted some restrictions to try and protect the fur trade. For instance, he required that any canoes or any vessels coming out here with trade goods have a permit. They had to have licenses. And of about 155 total canoes that were permitted to come out into the West in 1777, 120 of them came here to Michilimackinac. The others went to smaller trading posts, but the bulk of them came here to Michilimackinac. And remember, those canoes, those bateaux, which are essentially large rowboats that are coming here, are full of trade goods. Merchants would hire voyageurs, so people to actually row or paddle those vessels, and then they would also buy tons and tons of trade goods to ship out here. And those trade goods could be axes, they could be pots and pans, they could be firearms, especially they were textiles. That's probably the most common trade item, but they all get shipped out here to Michilimackinac. The merchants would often also come here to Michilimackinac and live here seasonally just to make sure everything ran smoothly. At the same time that those trade goods were coming out of the east from cities like Montreal, there would be other canoes full of furs coming out of the west, coming from Native American communities in Wisconsin and Minnesota up into Canada, where there were other traders who had actually been living amongst the Native people all winter long, buying up furs from them. It's the Native people who actually trap the animals. It's usually the men who do the trapping. Women prepare the furs for sale. Those furs then get shipped here to Michilimackinac, and the merchants supervise their transshipment. So you have all those trade goods here, you have all those furs here, and the merchants were here to make sure that everything ran smoothly as one cargo was unloaded and loaded into another vessel. And then when the canoes went back out west and up north to those small trading posts and Native American communities, they were full of trade goods. And those trade goods, again, you can think of them like money. You can think of them like cash, because that's what would be used to buy more furs from those native trappers in the coming winter. Meanwhile, the vessels going back east to Montreal and ultimately over to Europe, those would have been full of all of those furs. So there's these two big circles going around and around. You've got trade goods coming out of the east, furs coming out of the west, and those circles intersect here at Michilimackinac. And again, that's why this place is so important. That's why there were all these people here, and why it was also such an ideal place to gather all of those war parties that were going to be sent out east, because it's astride the main trade routes. So again, the summer of 1777, very, very successful for the merchant community here at Michilimackinac. The government had instituted a few other restrictions on the Great Lakes trade, again, mostly to make sure that no trade goods fell into American hands. But at this point in time, in 1777, they weren't particularly restrictive. The merchant community here wasn't too concerned about them yet. Over time, however, in the coming years, those restrictions would become a little bit more burdensome on the merchant community. But again, in 1777, things went pretty well for them. Meanwhile, back out east, that main campaign, Burgoyne's main army, is starting to move south out of Canada. So let's actually take a look at how that campaign began and take it up to the point where the people from Michilimackinac actually would have joined up with it. So at about the same time that de Pister was sending off that very large war party from Michilimackinac in mid-June, Burgoyne was formally opening the campaign out east. Now, in addition to the few thousand British and German and Canadian troops under his command, he did already have a sizable number of Native Americans aligned with his army. They came from a whole variety of tribal groups in the St. Lawrence River Valley and also in New York. And Burgoyne, from the beginning, intended to use those Native warriors not only as skirmishers and as scouts, so operating out in front of the main body of his army, but also to use them as a terror weapon. Everyone knew that the Americans had kind of this innate fear of Native Americans based on literally centuries at this point of clashes with Native people out on the frontiers. But unfortunately, Burgoyne tried to have it both ways. He both wanted to utilize those Native warriors as a terror weapon, but he also wanted to make sure that they didn't go too far and give the British a bad name. He said he wanted to rein in their cruelty while keeping up their terror. And to that end, he actually instituted a series of rules that were supposed to govern the way these Native men were going to fight on the battlefield. He specifically told them that they were not to engage in combat unless they encountered armed resistance. They were not to target non-combatants, so they weren't supposed to go after women and children or old people. They were not supposed to bring him scalps, expecting some sort of reward. He actually refused to pay if they brought him a scalp. He would, however, pay if they brought him a live prisoner. And he also forbade them from scalping living prisoners. They could only take scalps from people who were already dead. And this kind of ran ran counter to a lot of the ways that these native men would have been accustomed to fighting. Now, furthermore, Burgoyne didn't include any native people in his chain of command, and he also really marginalized and ignored employees of the British Indian Department, which was a government agency specifically set up to act as a liaison between the government and all of these various native nations. Burgoyne simply chose not to listen to those people who probably would have had a pretty good handle on how the native people were thinking and the way that they wanted to fight. Now, as June progresses into early July, that British Army is able to successfully move southwards down Lake Champlain. They get to Ticonderoga at the south end of the lake, where the Americans had built a huge stronghold, a huge fortified camp. They had also sort of refortified Ticonderoga itself. Burgoyne had expected to spend a lot of time at Ticonderoga. He was planning perhaps to besiege that place, but instead, right around 4th of July, 1777, some of his engineers discovered that the Americans had failed to fortify some high ground overlooking Ticonderoga. So Burgoyne dispatched some artillery up there looking down at these American positions. The Americans realized that their positions were untenable. So by about July 6th, they retreated, more or less without firing a shot. So Burgoyne had successfully captured Lake Champlain with very, very little resistance, but that came with a couple of failures. One, the Americans had essentially escaped. Since they had retreated before Burgoyne was set up to actually start a battle with them, they got away more or less intact. And furthermore, since Burgoyne had planned for an extended siege down at Ticonderoga, his supply lines were not quite ready yet to continue that chase as the Americans continued to fall back towards the Hudson River. So as a result, the British ended up just kind of sticking around at Ticonderoga for a few weeks as they waited for supplies to catch up with them. These problems are further made worse by the fact that Burgoyne and Guy Carleton, the governor of Quebec province, really did not like each other. Remember that Burgoyne was one of the ones criticizing Carleton for his actions in 1776. As a result, Carleton was in no hurry to speed up supplies down to Burgoyne. He was really in no hurry to release reinforcements so they could garrison Ticonderoga, and Burgoyne could actually take his whole army off to pursue those Americans. So again, as a result, the British spent a lot of July just kind of milling about at the south end of Lake Champlain, engaging in small clashes with the Americans, but there really were no major engagements during that time. But it's at this time that 400-man war party from Michilimackinac finally shows up. So let's actually look at their contributions to the Burgoyne campaign next. So even as the main body of Burgoyne's army was moving south along Lake Champlain, de Pister was still continuing the war effort here at Michilimackinac even after that war party had departed. He actually spent most of the summer of 1777 trying to counter Spanish and American influence amongst the tribes of the far west. They had agents out trying to stir up those tribal groups, maybe trying to turn them against the British, or at the very least trying to convince those groups to remain neutral. De Pister, in turn, relied upon a whole network of traders based here at Michilimackinac. Many of those people had relatives in these native communities, and so de Pister tasked them with dispelling a lot of these rumors. Here at Michilimackinac, he also arrested a trader, a man named Thomas Bentley, who was accused of stirring up the tribes down in the Illinois country and just generally being a rebel agitator. Now, Langlade's war party actually reached Montreal at the end of June. They were dispatched south to link up with Burgoyne, and they ended up joining the main army on about July 17th. And the British Army at this point in time was kind of stuck between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. There was a lot of low-level fighting going on, and in fact, the Michilimackinac War Party was probably in action for the first time on about July 20th at a place called Fort Anne. Again, these were not big set-piece battles. Instead, there were small raids on outposts. There were skirmishes between small groups of soldiers. But again, the Michilimackinac War Party seized combat for the first time on July 20th. Now, just about a week later, the Michilimackinac War Party would be involved in a pretty controversial incident. On July 26th, members of that war party had fought a small battle earlier in the morning. A rainstorm had kind of put an end to that battle, and they had taken shelter in some abandoned houses around Fort Anne. And while they were in those houses, they discovered a couple of women, including a young woman named Jane McCrae, who was an American. She was engaged to a loyalist officer serving with Burgoyne's army. And so these men in the war party decided to escort her back to the British camp. And they expected some sort of reward for doing that, for getting her there safely. At some point, an argument broke out, apparently over who would get to claim that reward. And to resolve that argument, one of the men in that war party, who was probably an Anishinaabe man, perhaps an Odawa man, so probably someone from here at Michilimackinac, simply killed Jane McCrae as an easy way to resolve that dispute. There was really nothing surprising about that. That was pretty common when dealing with prisoners or people that were being escorted. It was seen as a perfectly normal way of resolving this dispute. So the men of that war party didn't think much of it and went about their business. They went back to the British camp later that day. But when Burgoyne and the other British officers found out about this, they were furious. And so the next day, on July 27th, they actually convened a council with all of the native men serving with Burgoyne's army, and Burgoyne lectured them at length about how wrong this had been. And many of these native warriors decided that they had had enough. They didn't need to be yelled at by Burgoyne. They didn't need to be yelled at by this man who didn't understand their culture or their way of fighting. And they were ready to leave right then. They were ready to pack up and go home on July 27th. Fortunately, Langlade and some of the other liaison officers were able to kind of calm them down and convince them to stay, but Burgoyne did institute some new additional rules to further govern the way that those war parties were going to be fighting. Now, contrary to popular belief, the murder of Jane McCrae was really not a propaganda tool for the Americans. People have claimed for a long time that the Americans looked at this and used it to their advantage to point out how brutal the British were in employing their Native American allies on the battlefield. But in fact, it actually had the opposite effect. It heightened the terror that Americans had of these war parties, and Burgoyne really didn't see that. All he saw was the potential damage that this incident would do to the British war effort. So this council on July 27th really marks a break between a lot of the native men serving alongside Burgoyne's army and the British command structure. And they're just going to limp along for the next few days. And in fact, by about August 5th, the Michilimackinac War Party went to Burgoyne and asked him to leave. They wanted to go home then, because for them, they had accomplished their mission. They had traveled a great distance. They had fought in battle. They had won some personal honor. They had captured some prizes that they could take back home with them. And for those men, they had accomplished what they had set out to do. Burgoyne had to intervene, and he essentially begged them to stay with his army a little bit longer. He was getting ready to move further south, to move towards Albany, and he at least convinced that Michilimackinac War Party to stick around with the main body of the British force until they got to Albany. And soon thereafter, Burgoyne started moving again, and the campaign would start to enter its final phases. So although the various native groups fighting alongside the British were getting more and more dissatisfied with the way that Burgoyne was treating them and the way that the war was going, they decided to stick with Burgoyne as he moved the army towards the Hudson River, towards Albany, and towards New York City. Now, keep in mind that this is not the only campaign taking place at this point in time. There was still that diversionary attack taking place in western New York, where Barry St. Ledger was supposed to attack targets in the Mohawk Valley. That got underway a little bit earlier in the summer, again using a large combined force of British soldiers and Native American men from a variety of different nations. And that went okay until the British got to a place called Fort Stanwix. They expected to find that fort in ruins, but instead, once they got there, they discovered that the Americans had heavily fortified it. St. Ledger's forces were not equipped for a protracted siege, so all they could do was essentially wait outside. In early August, they actually fought an incredibly violent battle nearby at a place called Oriskany. It was a British victory. They inflicted terrible losses upon the Americans, but they simply could not dislodge them from Fort Stanwix. And ultimately, towards the end of August, St. Ledger was forced to withdraw back west. So that whole diversionary attack kind of ended in failure. It didn't really accomplish much of anything. William Howe, however, experienced quite a bit more success. Again, he's commanding the main British army in the American colonies. And in fact, by September, he had been able to capture Philadelphia. He had landed a huge army, marched overland, and captured the rebel capital. The Continental Congress had to flee out into the countryside, and Howe then settled into winter quarters in Philadelphia. Meanwhile, the Americans also went into their winter quarters. This is where they go into winter quarters at Valley Forge, and they essentially decided to wait one another out until the 1778 campaign season. Now, back in New York, Burgoyne continues to march his forces along the Hudson River. Meanwhile, the Americans, who had escaped more or less unscathed from Ticonderoga back in the early part of July, were starting to fortify a place called Saratoga. And that's ultimately where the British and the Americans would meet. But as all this is going on, dissatisfaction amongst those various native war parties continues to grow. And so by about August 20th, the Michilimackinac War Party, Langlade's War Party, they've decided that they have had enough and they departed. So they actually left Burgoyne at that point. Many of the other native groups followed suit soon thereafter. And so when Burgoyne did begin engaging the Americans around Saratoga in September, there were very few, if any, Native Americans still fighting alongside the British Army. Now, the British were suffering from all sorts of troubles, mostly related to their supply lines as they started to engage the Americans around Saratoga. And once again, the whole campaign kind of got bogged down into a much more static situation. The British were able to engage the Americans successfully a few times, but with more and more casualties, with fewer and fewer reinforcements. With the British Army occupying Philadelphia, Howe was not able to send reinforcements, which they already knew that was going to happen, but it just really hammered things home. By mid-October, actually October 17th, Burgoyne was actually forced to surrender what was left of the British Army at Saratoga to the Americans. And this was a major victory for the American forces. Not only had they defeated this northern invasion, they had defeated Burgoyne's army, they also got some attention on the international stage, because it's after this American victory at Saratoga that the French government really started to pay attention to what the Americans were doing. The French had clandestinely been supplying the Americans with arms, with money. They had been sending officers over. So, for instance, the Marquis de Lafayette had joined the American army earlier that summer. But after Saratoga, the French decided to throw in their hats with the Americans, and that choice would actually turn the American Revolution into a world war. Now, fortunately, Langlade and the Michilimackinac War Party left before any of that happened, so they were not caught up in the capitulation at Saratoga. But because they were traveling at that point in time, people here at Michilimackinac really were unclear about